well, why are we here? Yes, Jess.
Yeah,
That's right, so we can listen to a Holocaust survivor. Mrs. Kirchheimer is a Holocaust survivor. She's going to be telling us her story shortly. And why now and not some other time? PJ?
because on Sunday it was like the Remembrance Day for
Right.
the Holocaust.
Okay, and what do we call that? Yom HaShoah. What does Yom mean?
Day of Remembrance.
Well, Yom means day. HaShoah refers to the Holocaust or the catastrophe or it's a pretty powerful word. So the day of remembering the Holocaust. Okay. And yes, it was Sunday night to Monday, I believe. It was like that was how the day was. Did anybody see anything about the Holocaust on TV, on the internet? Yeah, what did you see?
Me?
Samantha.
Well, I went to a museum in like Paris and they have stuff from the Holocaust there.
Yeah.
I did a whole research project on it.
Did you do your 6th grade project on the Holocaust?
Yeah, we did.
Oh.
He interviewed Mr. Walke
Oh, really? Did you invite him to come
to
to see the project? Because one year, one of our students interviewed Mrs. Forden about Israel. She went to Central School that day to see. Next time.
yeah.
Okay. That was really nice that you did that. Yes, Lily? Okay, do you remember the name of the person? Okay, and was that a Jewish person or a non-Jewish person? He was a non-Jewish person who knew a lot of Jews. Yeah, Jess? Sorry? What if they're... Oh, that day? It wasn't in class? No, what? So what did you want to share? Okay. All right. So did anybody notice anything that would tell you it's the Holocaust, that we're remembering the Holocaust here at North Shore Congregation Israel? What was, did anybody notice anything? Yes. The yellow flags. Where are the yellow flags? Okay, outside where? On the lawn. Okay, as you drive up, they were on the lawn. And who do we have to thank for the flags being put up? Yes?
I helped.
You helped. Hopefully most, if not all, of our 6th graders also had that opportunity to help put out the flags because our 6th graders, we have them take responsibility for Jewish living and learning, and that's an important thing. Do you know what flags you're going to be replacing them with shortly? Yes. Blue. Not just blue, but blue as well.
Green.
No, don't guess. Don't
Blue and white flags to celebrate Israel's independence.
Correct. So, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yes, in the chairs, please, gentlemen. Sorry, now I need to bring up Mrs. Gordon. Where is she? Carmen, where are they? They work there. Oh, is everybody here?
Well, aren't you coming from Mrs. Gordon's room?
Oh, okay, then
Who
we're
else is
fine.
missing? Just the two
All
of
right,
you?
then we're fine. Mrs. Gordon.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to replace those, or the 6th graders will replace the yellow flags with the flag of the state of Israel, because first we have our sadness of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and then we have the joy of celebrating the founding of the state of Israel. Yes, Jess? Why are the flags yellow? Yeah, exactly, because of the yellow stars. And what were the yellow stars, Lauren?
Well, the flags are yellow because the people in the Holocaust had to wear yellow shirts so we could see them.
Rich people in the Holocaust.
The Jewish people would have to
on the other hand is very uplifting for all of us. And we've always felt very fortunate to have Mrs. Kirchheimer here. She's a member of our congregation. How many of you had seen Mrs. Kirchheimer before her sitting right here today in this seat? Okay. Right, Mrs. Kirchheimer was actually a Grand Mahonic for a while. You know what our Grand Mahonic is?
No.
Okay, so you know we have Mahonics who are in high school. A Grand Mahonic is somebody, Mrs. Kirchheimer is no longer in high school. Okay, so we called her a Grand Mahonic, and it's just as I say, she wasn't very good at fighting germ warfare, which is, so there were too many germs running around, and she wasn't able to continue with that. But Mrs. Kirchheimer is here. She does many things. She was an adult bat mitzvah here. Any learning opportunity, she's the first one. No, she's the second one there. Arvie's the first one there. Mrs. Kirchheimer's the second one there. But she's always, if you want to know anything about any Jewish book, Mrs. Kirchheimer is the person to talk to. She reads more books, not just Jewish ones, but more books than anybody else that I know. And she's a volunteer here in so many different ways. How many of you have actually ever entered the school building through the hallway by the school office? You know where Jennifer sits? Anybody ever enter that one? Well, that hallway is dedicated to Mrs. Kirchheimer. Her family members did that for her, and one of the reasons that they chose that place is because of her commitment to Jewish learning and living. And so I feel very fortunate that Mrs. Kirchheimer is here to be able to tell her story. She did it yesterday, and she's going to do it again today. And what we're going to do is she will speak for a while, and then we will have time for questions. We'll take the fifth graders out, and they'll do a little bit of an overview together. And then she'll have more time to answer questions for the sixth, seventh graders, our Mahonics, and our adults. All right, does that sound? All right, so if you can't, the other thing, I'm sorry, is that before we send away the fifth graders, we will do a service in memory of the 6 million Jews that died. Hence, we have the candles. There are 7 candles. These are, excuse me for going in front of you. These are yard side. This is a regular yard side candle. Does anybody know what a yard side candle is for? Lauren?
You light a yard side candle in remembrance of the day someone died.
Right, on the anniversary of the death of someone, their burial, yes. And this is a regular yard side candle, so you might light it for one of your own relatives. And why do we have 6 of them? 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. And then we have this candle, which is yellow. And why do you think we have a yellow candle? What's this candle? Yes?
To represent like the Jews, how they wore the yellow stars.
That's right. So this is a special Holocaust candle just commemorating the Holocaust. So it's another way. And yes, it's because the yellow is for the reminder of the Jewish stuff. Okay. So without further ado, Mrs. Kirchheimer?
Thank you very much.
Let's just make sure.
Won't bite? Okay. Well, I'm happy to see so many of you, and just from the comments, you seem to know quite a lot, so perhaps I won't have to speak so much. But I'd like to ask, have any of you been to the Holocaust Museum in Skokie? So, okay, very good. And the other question I'd like to ask, have any of you in your families had reason to discuss, perhaps members of the family perhaps great-great-grandparents or such who were lost in the Holocaust? Anyone in the family? No? You have? Okay. Now yesterday, as was said, I spoke to younger children, and for me, the Holocaust really began when I was between 9 and 10 years old. I lived in Germany. I had a wonderful childhood up to that point, and about in the mid-30s, I suddenly had to change schools. I had gone to a public school, whatever it was called, where children of all religions went, but suddenly Jewish children had to go to a Jewish school, which at first didn't seem so terrible, because in addition to learning all the regular subjects, we learned more about Jewish history, and we learned Hebrew. And it's one thing that I really, if I can say I'm grateful for that, the Hebrew I learned at that time to read and to write, I remembered, even when I got old, even I hadn't used it for some time in between. So that's one thing I treasure very much. But in addition to having to change schools, suddenly my friends and I, we used to go to parks to play, in the summer to public swimming pools. We couldn't any longer. There were signs, no Jews allowed. So, okay, at first, it was a bother. You know, children, they make other plans. And my friends and I, the girls, in those days, girls played with dolls, pretty much. I don't think any of you do that anymore. But we made up our own games. But suddenly, there were signs on stores, no Jews allowed. And our world kind of shrank into going to school, coming home, playing with your close friends who lived nearby. And at that time, I would have been 8, 9 years old, I noticed a certain strain from my parents, although I have to explain, in those days, I'm talking in the middle 30s, which seems like 100 years ago or more to you, parents did not discuss things with their children the way we do now, or even the way we spoke to my children. Children were kind of seen and not heard, and they had to behave very well. Discipline was spelled with a capital D, and especially at school. We had to, when we weren't actually doing anything, writing or drawing or whatever we were told to do, we had to sit with our hands on the desk, and if we talked to somebody next to us, around came the teacher with a cane and kind of rapped you over the knuckles. And I always blame my colored knuckles, because I got hit a lot. I guess I talked too much. But that's the way things were in those days. And then suddenly, instead of going to play after school, my mother told me to come right home. We just didn't spend any time just being outside playing. We pretty much had to stay close to home. And even though now you sometimes see on television and old films, Hitler marching with troops, since there was no television in those days, unless it happened right in where you lived or knew where you lived, you didn't see that. The only way you heard was when he spoke on the radio. And when he did speak on the radio, and I vaguely remember this, everyone, and I lived in an apartment building, to explain, on a big street, big apartment building, very nice. You heard his voice, and I learned later that everyone had to have their radio on. If you didn't, if your house or apartment was quiet, they could come in and say, "Why aren't you listening?" I mean, this is the way they controlled the population. And then an event happened, and things got tighter and tighter as far as stores not serving Jews, and then if there was a Jewish store, a shop owned by Jews, they would paint a big Magen David on it just to entice some of the hoodlums, of which there were many, to smash the windows. And this happened all the time. Until November 1938. Now, those of you who've been to the museum, you've heard the word Kristallnacht. Maybe you've even learned it here. A young Jewish man killed a Nazi officer in Paris because his parents had been mistreated by the Nazis. And that, if they needed an excuse, gave the Nazis an excuse to go all out against the Jews. And that evening, late afternoon evening, just speaking for myself, in our apartment, a Nazi stormtrooper came in. Maybe there were 2 or 3 of them. They just burst in, herded us into the kitchen, and proceeded to destroy everything in the apartment. Furniture, knocked over everything, heard china, glass, everything crashing. Then we heard them smashing windows, and afterwards realized they had thrown books, all our books, out of the windows, that they could burn them in front of the building on the sidewalk. And this went on, I don't remember how long, might have been an hour, but I can't remember at the time. And then they took my father away when they left. So, from then on, things got worse and worse. First of all, the next day, and while I don't remember a lot of things, I remember I had to go with my mother to the local police station to take all our silverware and anything such as, silver candlesticks or whatever silver items you might have in your home, to the police station, because the Nazis decided that the Jews would have to pay for the damage that the Nazis were causing. This was one of their diabolical ways of thinking. And needless to say, the fact that my father was gone was so traumatic. And I have to add that I had a brother. He was 4 years older than I, and he was, better? He was away at school in Italy at this time. So I don't remember exactly. As I said, I was between 9 and 10 years old. I know my mother was frantic, doing things. I can't even say what. She could no longer go shopping because the stores where she might have normally shopped, no Jews were allowed. But we had a housekeeper who had been with us for many, many years, and she wasn't Jewish, and so she did shopping for us when we needed it. And also, as I learned later, my mother tried every which way to get my father out of the concentration camp where he had been taken, to Dachau. You may have heard that name. It was one of the first big concentration camps. And eventually, and to this day, I never know how or why she was able to get his release, and he came home, but he was a totally destroyed man. He was a very tall, good-looking man. He came home, he looked just terrible, and his head was shaved, and it just in terrible shape. And so one of the first things my mother did was to try to find a place where he could go. There were several countries which took Jewish refugees, but most of them by that time had decided they had enough. They didn't want any more. And Shanghai in China was one of those places where Jews could still go without a visa. And so obviously my mother enabled my father to go there. And of course that's the last time I saw him because, well, I'll mention that later. Also, my mother learned that there was such a thing as a kindertransport, which you probably saw and learned about in the museum. England had said they would take 20,000 children, just children, for the time. And see, everyone thought this was a temporary thing. This couldn't possibly go on forever. So England said they would take 20,000 children so they would be safe and out of the way. And people in England opened their homes, mostly Jewish, but many not Jewish homes, and took a child, or some people took 2 or even 3 children for the time being, the phrase used. And so my mother enabled me to go on one of those. Now, I don't know how you would have felt at the age of 10. Now I'm talking the spring of 1939. I was 10 years old then. She told me I would be going to England and living with a strange family, but it would only be for a little while and we'd be together soon. And she packed my suitcase. She took me to the station. And as it happens, I've learned since then, sometimes when something very traumatic happens to you, your mind refuses to remember. And my mind stopped at that railroad station until I ended up at the railroad station in London, sitting on my suitcase. Now, in between, the train had to go from Mannheim, Germany, which was a large city, to Hamburg, which is one of the big ports in Germany, and had to go on a boat to go across the English Channel, go to England, go down another train and go to London. I remember nothing of that at all. But obviously I got there. And there were a lot of children with suitcases, and we all had a big number hanging around our neck. And suddenly a family came up to me and said they would take me home. And they took me home. Now I didn't speak a word of English, and the only thing that, except maybe I'm sure my mother taught me to say thank you, because in Germany, discipline and politeness was the big word. And the family had originally, so happened, come from Poland, and they spoke Yiddish. Now, I didn't know Yiddish, but there's enough in Yiddish with a little bit of German you can make yourself understood, and that helped quite a bit. But I was put in school immediately. And again, in those days, there was no such thing as English as a second language or whatever that would be over there. It was English, period. And I learned very fast, besides which I wanted to forget German. Suddenly, anything German I didn't want to touch. And everything was going along fine. The family, they were kind to me, and you know, they had older children. And I learned to always obey. That's the one thing, because children in Germany always obeyed adults. They never talked back or argued. And as I was getting used to the school, suddenly, as the war came closer, the World War II, now we're talking 1939, I'm talking late spring, early summer, 1939, the British decided to evacuate the children, the younger children from London, because they knew there would be bombing. And so there I was again being shifted to a village in south of England, in southern England. And there, the villagers took in children just because they were asked to do that. The British people, all during the war, were wonderful. Whatever they were asked to do to make it safer and better so that the government would fight the war and not have to worry about civilians too much, they did. It was remarkable. And so we went to school. I remember walking through fields with cows and bulls and who knows what else. And this was quite a new experience. I'd never lived in the country before. And we were, we were friends, but we were in different homes among the villagers. And at night, once the war began in September of 1939, and soon after when the bombing began, we would watch the fires in London. It's like if the schools in Chicago were evacuated and they sent everyone to Waukegan, you could still see the fires at night, I think, from Chicago. I mean, in England, everything is so close. So I don't even remember just how long this took. I mean, how long we were in the country. It had to be at least a year or more. And then we were sent back to London. But the family that I had lived with in London, their house had been bombed. And they had moved to another city, Nottingham, which is in the Midlands, if you look at a map of England. And which at that time, it was the drabbest city I can imagine. It was a very industrial area. And the only nice thing about Nottingham is that Sherwood Forest is there. So if you ever go to England, you want to see Sherwood Forest, you have to go to Nottingham. And I understand it's become a very, very nice city now. But, so I was back in London, and in Nottingham, I'm sorry. And I finished school, and then because I couldn't afford to go to high school, the system they have there, I had to go to work, which I did. And then eventually, the family moved back to London, and of course I went back to London, and I had another job there, and I did find some relatives of mine who had lived in London for many, many years. And so partly I lived with them and partly with the family who had taken me in at the beginning. Now, in the meantime, I had had some communication from my mother through the Red Cross, because after the war began, there was no regular mail between the countries. And she had been sent to a concentration camp in Vichy, France, because the French, many of them, not all of them, collaborated with the Germans and had set up several concentration camps. And I learned later that she had been sent from there to Auschwitz, where she was killed. And to show how the Germans, how they kept records, those of us who read all these things and learned about them, I got a certificate telling me that my mother was killed at Auschwitz on November 2nd at 11 a.m. I mean, can you imagine people who do these dreadful things to actually keep records, and so they can boast about it? Now, the other thing I had brought in, perhaps I'm talking too many different areas, my brother, who had been in Italy, he had managed to come to England before the war began. And because he was 15 or 16 at the time, he was interned by the British. They did that because they couldn't tell whether a man, a woman for that matter, but a man, was a German refugee, a Jewish refugee, or a Nazi spy. So they interned most what they called enemy aliens. That's the way they described them. They treated them okay. I mean, there's no luxury, but they were treated well. My brother was sent to Australia. There were a whole group of young, I think they were mostly young people, and they even had more schooling there. They were in large camps, and we communicated with one another. And he seemed to know, being older, of course, a little more what was going on. He had been in touch with my father, who was in Shanghai, as I said earlier. And eventually, I even heard from my father through the Red Cross. They enabled people to communicate with each other. And when my brother was probably around 16 or 17, maybe, well, whatever age, he had the opportunity to come back to England and join the British Army or go to Palestine. Now the latter, to this day, I have no answer, because at that time the British were trying to keep Jews out of Palestine. And why he was even given the option of going to Palestine, which, for you who don't remember, before Israel became a state, it was Palestine. But he chose to come to England because, first of all, I was there, and he would have joined the British Army. And we had a cousin who was with him at this camp, who chose to go to Palestine, who is still living there in Israel. He must be in his 90s now. I'm in my 80s, so he's going to be in his 90s. And because he was very, very Orthodox. And so he chose to go to Palestine. And my brother chose to come to England, and on the way back, his ship was torpedoed. So I lost my brother. And then I learned that my father had died in Shanghai. So there went my family. And after the war, when in 1945, the war was over, they posted on government buildings in London lists of people, survivors in the concentration camp. And of course, I went to look all the time. I never saw my mother's name. And as I explained, obviously she had been killed much earlier. And then eventually, my visa came through. I didn't even expect it. I didn't think about it. And I had the opportunity to come to the United States. And I almost decided not to come, because I had a life in England. I had friends, was working, and, I thought, well, this is it. Why start a new life? But I'm happy to say I did come, and I've had a wonderful life here. And I'm happy to say the rest of my life was very good. And it's a part of our history that, it's easy to forget, perhaps. But when you think of 6 million people being killed just because they had a certain faith, and the irony is, I believe it's in Prague, where there is a synagogue, if I'm wrong, please correct me, which the Nazis had selected to be a museum of this once Jewish race, which is Jewish people, that is no longer around. But this is some of the, these are some of the artifacts that they used in their religion. So we can look at that and think, who's surviving now? And I hope that the fact that you children are here and you're learning, this is what we need to do. We have to build up the Jewish people again and keep them strong.
Who has some questions for Mrs. Kirchheimer? And adults, our parents, our members of the Women of NSCI, teachers, if you'd like to ask a question. Yes.
So Lori, when you were on that particular kinder transport, I know 20,000 children didn't all come at once on one
Right.
train. How many other children went from Mannheim or from with you? Do you recall?
Well, as I said, my mind is totally blank. I know there was a full platform, on the train station.
We're going to get you talking to the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. On the train station. station, you have platforms along the train. I know, I can see it was full of parents and children. That's all I know. There were, and that wasn't the only one. There were others, other
And
groups.
so were there other children in London that you knew from Mannheim, or
No.
were you isolated from anyone you knew?
But now I know I've met other people, and I even have a first cousin who was in a group of children from another city. I never met another child from the transport, from the kinder transport. Never. The whole time I was in London, and even like the first part, I never had opportunity to go to synagogues and such, because the people I lived with, while they were Jewish and they kept kosher, but I don't remember any other observance. And I was from a very Orthodox home. But I never met another child, or kinder transport child.
Okay, we're gonna start with 2 questions here, then we'll come around.
Since your cousin went to Palestine, have you seen him at all?
Yes, I saw him. I've been to Israel many times, and I've seen him. And he's still around, as far as I know.
How did your father pass away in Shanghai?
He got ill. It wasn't mistreatment. Of course, he lived in very poor conditions, but he became ill, and in those days, there are a lot of things that they couldn't, couldn't heal.
Did you ever go back to
Can
Germany?
you talk a little bit louder?
No,
Did you ever go back to Germany?
no, I did. Once by accident. That sounds kind of silly. The first time I flew to Israel, I chose to fly by TWA. In those days, we didn't have so many airlines to choose from. And I didn't realize that they stopped in Frankfurt. And I'll have a quick funny story. At that time, my daughter and I, we were traveling together, and she had become Hasidic while she was in college. And it was early in the morning when we landed in Frankfurt, and we had to go through customs, and the people, they had men to check women, and women to, go over women to make sure they had nothing wrong on their person, no bombs or anything. And I just had this feeling these women must have been guards in the concentration camps. They looked so. But my daughter, then they drove us out to the plane, because this was during the time when there were hijackings. You may not remember this, but older people will. So there were many precautions at airports. And so the plane to Israel, not everyone on the TWA plane was going to Israel, but anyway, they drove us in a bus to the plane, and we were guarded by soldiers with machine guns, and I had the feeling they would love to kill us because we were Jews going to Israel. But anyway, we got on the plane, and my daughter, because Hasidic people pray, many times, at least 5, if not more times a day, and it was early in the morning, she had to do her morning davening, which she did on the plane. And I felt so good that here was my daughter praying on German soil on our way to Israel. So that gave me a good feeling for that moment.
I know that most people, that Germany is giving you can apply for citizenship, because you were driven out of Germany because of the Holocaust. Have you ever applied for German
No, I
citizenship?
would never. And many people, and I don't blame them, they've gone back. Sometimes their towns invite them back for a vacation, and honor them and treat them very well to try to make up for what they went through. And I would never. Some people do. I just couldn't. And there's another funny story. One of my sons, in high school, when he had to choose a language, he chose German. Why? He thought I could help him with his homework. The first time he came home with a list of words, I couldn't read any one of them. I had no idea what they meant. So, but he learned German then.
Other questions? Yes.
So,
in fact, what they have done for the state of Israel, that's the way it started, with what they call reparations. They try to make up for the financial losses, which they can't bring back people who are killed, but all the financial difficulties and other problems that they caused. So they have tried in that way, and I guess you give them credit, and I presume the younger people, in fact, there are interns who work at the Holocaust Museum from Germany and Austria, and they come over for 1 year, and they have studied the Holocaust in their home countries, but they come over to work and learn more at the Holocaust Museum. So the younger people are learning.
Some more questions? Fifth graders, any more questions? Because we'll do our service and then we'll send you off. So, together, we're going to say the Kaddish Prayer, which is a prayer that we say. When do we say Kaddish? What's one of the? Why are we saying Kaddish now? Yes, Lauren. In remembrance of all the people who died. And one of the reasons that we rise for the Kaddish, because sometimes it's the custom that just the person who's mourning and remembering the dead person is the only one who rises, so it's a way of knowing, in Jewish tradition, a way of knowing who are mourners. But very often in the Reform movement, we all rise, and for sure today we're all going to rise, because there are many people who died in the Holocaust for whom there's nobody to say Kaddish in their memory. So we are going to be serving that role today, not just for those for whom there is no one left to say Kaddish for them, other than for all of us who care about them, as well as the others who may have some family members, but the death of 6 million Jews is the death of a lot of people. And there were other people who died in the Holocaust, not the war, but the Holocaust, because other peoples were persecuted. So, you know what persecuted is, yes? Or discriminated against, and then this way when they were killed. And so, as Jews, as people who are Jews and friends of Jews, we feel that it's very important to remember other people who are persecuted as well. Today, in particular, we remember those in the Holocaust, and Lori, we want to give you the opportunity to light the candles. We're going to take one moment, though, don't do it quite yet. We're going to pass out the mourner's Kaddish so that you have the words in front of you, and we'll end with the singing of Hatikvah. Yes, please, if we could get some helpers to pass these out, that would be great. Yeah, we can take some of them and just pass them back. And why do you think we're going to end, while we're passing it out, and still listen? Remember discipline, what Mrs. Kirchheimer said. So we're going to end with the Hatikvah song. Why do you think we're going to end with Hatikvah? Yes, Lily. It's the Israeli national anthem, and what does Hatikvah mean? Hope. Okay. All right, folks, if we can have your attention, please. Please all rise. was when she was 10 years old. Think about that. That's like those guys over there, 5th graders. And all through your late childhood and adolescence, to be such a brave person. You are an inspiration to each and every one of us. And we hope to be able to carry on the tradition of living as Jews, as free Jews in this country today. And we have a special gift for you. Someone has a special gift for you. So thank you very much.
I'm happy to be here, and it makes me feel so happy and good to see all of you becoming good Jews and to keep on learning and then teaching others.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So 5th graders, Mrs. Kirchheimer is gonna, Mrs. Haynesfuller is gonna take you over that way. And we are, actually, Lori, we can get a picture of you,
Both
with both of us, all right?
so we will know it's here, no.
Just wait for me one second. And 6 and 7.
Oh, maybe we should find her hair.
And 6 and 7 graders. All right, 5th graders over there, 6th and 7th graders will stay seated for a few more minutes. Okay, 5th graders, you can go on out. Mr. Axelrod's Kirchheimer promises to stay afterwards, but we're going to see if there are a few more questions. Is that all right?
What's happening? She said to stay for 6 then 7? I'm up here. Does anyone have any further questions for Mrs. Kirchheimer? Did you raise your hand? Yes, go ahead.
Clearly from the introduction, you are very active in the temple here and a lifelong Jewish learner. Do you think that your experience in the Holocaust strengthened your faith and your commitment to Judaism?
No, I tell you, it began as when I was a child. I was brought up in a very observant home. To show you how observant, if my birthday was on a Shabbat, I couldn't open my presents until the next day, Sunday. So we were at the synagogue all the time. In fact, one of my last happy memories, and this would have been in the spring of before the Kristallnacht, so that goes back to 1938, was this family Seder. Huge, the whole family there. And as a young child, we had to sit through the whole thing. There were no shortcuts. And I remember I had a beautiful Haggadah, which had moving pictures, with the tabs where you can move things. And the one page I remember was where I could move Moses in his little basket down the river. And when I had children, I went all over Chicago. It was before the Googling time. Maybe now I could find it actually. To look for a garden like that. I never found one. But that's where I learned my Judaism. And all the years in England, and even the early years in this country, I lived with family who were not observant, really. All the time in England, most of the time, I never set foot in a synagogue. And, but once we moved here, and children were very young, but as soon as my eldest was old enough to go to religious school, we joined this temple. So I've been a member for 50-some years, 20 years. So, and now I even love it more than ever.
Yes.
Do you still stay in contact with the British family that?
Yes, I have. In fact, down now to one grandson. That's all that's left of that family. Yes, yes. Yeah, they were such good people. You would take a child in and look after a child that you don't know. And so that was, they were, and really Britain is full of good people. That's, I remember very well.
Somebody yesterday asked you what you thought of Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of England during the war.
Oh, he's my
And I thought it was a
hero.
really interesting answer.
Yeah, no, I thought he was wonderful, and of course, the older I get, I still read books by him and about him. And I think his spirit really kept the British people going until the Americans joined into the war, and no question about it. So,
And this past Sunday, I don't know if anybody saw it on public TV, there was a show about Sir Winton,
yeah.
who's 105 years old, who's British, and he was alive. Yes, and he was knighted by the Queen for his work with the Kinder transport.
Yeah,
And
from
he helped
Czechoslovakia.
save many thousands, I believe, children from Czechoslovakia. Yes, Jane.
Lori, I know that you're speaking at the Holocaust Museum. What is that experience like for you to retell your story?
Well, it's a little different, but I'm going to ask if any of you had been to the Holocaust Museum.
Yes, you asked some of, who were into the
Yeah,
Holocaust?
because I speak mostly to school groups, because now, as you probably know, the Holocaust has to be taught in the schools in Illinois. And during the school year, school groups come from the Chicago area. The other day there were groups from Iowa that had come in. And they're taken through the museum with a docent. And then they come to an auditorium, and either I or the other speakers speak to them. And some of them, and most of the time, they're not even Jewish children. So while they go through the museum and while they've learned something in school, I don't think it registers that much. If you haven't had a personal family, even not directly Holocaust related, but people have, you've talked about it, you've learned about it. But, and they ask some very interesting questions too. It's very enlightening. Yes.
When did the group from Iowa go?
I'm sorry.
You said a group from Iowa?
Yeah.
When did it?
When?
Yeah.
It was 2 weeks ago, I think. It was on Good Friday, because they had the day off. And I commiserated with them. Here they had a day off from school, ready they have to go to the Holocaust Museum.
Because my school went Monday.
Oh, did you? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Lori, will you tell about the Girl Scout troop
Oh,
and the Camden incident?
The other week, there was a Girl Scout group troop that had gone through the museum, and I spoke to, and I to make them feel at home. I said my daughter had been a brownie and a Girl Scout, and I was a Girl Scout leader. And so I wanted to point out, as they had gone through the museum and they saw pictures and about the Nazi youth group, because at that time when Hitler was in power, all the young people had to join the Nazi youth group. And I said the difference between their youth group and our scouting, Boy Scouts, is they were taught to hate. And we're teaching our scouts to be good citizens. So we have to remember, because young people can be easily manipulated. And we even learned that in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where children turned on their own parents. So it's important that we stay alert to things that go on in the world, and you know.
When you're speaking to different audiences, you're going to censor parts of the story.
Did everyone hear that? Karen asked if, when she speaks to different audiences, do you feel like you have to censor certain parts of your experience?
And not so much censor as to describe it in either more detail or a little differently. For instance, to non-Jewish groups, perhaps I might just use different words or something, you know, to understand.
I have a question. How old were your children when you first shared your experience with them?
You know, in a way I've really have forgotten, but I know one particular incident when my daughter, I think she was about 12, when the movie Exodus came out. And there
Tell
was,
them what the movie Exodus is about.
it's about this ship that with Jewish refugees that had come from Europe, and this ship that was practically falling apart, and finally came to Haifa and
Palestine.
to
Right,
Palestine
so
at that
coming
time.
from Europe,
Right.
going to Palestine.
And they were not allowed to land. The British were in charge at that time in Palestine. And there were terrible battles and trying to keep the people out, and many of them died right then and there, and some were taken to Cyprus, to camps, and I think others went back to, I don't know if that was the one that went back to Europe. No, I don't think so. Anyway, it was a very terrible story, but Hollywood made a movie about it. James Michener had written the book, Exodus. Was he the one?
Yes,
it was
he
James
wrote the
Michener.
book.
He was.
Neon Heroes.
Oh, was
sorry,
he on
yeah,
yours?
yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah, same idea.
Okay.
The historical fiction.
Right. And he wrote the book, and then Hollywood made a movie. I had read the book.
The Paul Moon.
Yes, I was at the guy.
Yeah.
And all the young girls were wild about Paul Newman. I mean,
Right.
if you had a Paul Newman now, you'd all go crazy to see his movie. So my daughter said, Mom, friends and I, we're going to go to see Exodus. And I said, no, you're not. And she said, why? I said, because Hollywood made the movie, and it's not the story of Exodus. And then that's when I really sat down. And so she must have been, I think, around 12, her brothers were younger. And actually, no one really spoke about the Holocaust until when Eichmann was on trial in Israel. That's when the Holocaust really was talked about. So, yeah.
Which is almost 20 years after the Holocaust.
Right.
So now that they're,
Wasn't it?
Well, I was in grammar school when they were broadcasting it. It had to be like 10 years after.
Oh, the 50s then?
Yeah, because I was in grammar school and I remember we had to stop all studies and listen to the radio.
Oh, really?
And we listened to all, oh my God, we were like 8 years old. We had to listen to all the descriptions and everything.
Oh, from Eichmann. Okay, so maybe it was the 50s, I may have the wrong date.
It had to be in the 50s, yeah.
Okay. The 50s, not the 60s.
so
Yeah, go ahead.
now that there are less and less survivors Holocaust survivors in the world, what do you think needs to happen in order for this generation and next generations to?
You know, I'm afraid with all the good intentions, there'll be good people, they'll keep it alive, the various Holocaust museums try their best, and by teaching as we do in the schools. You know, you hear about the African Americans, young people, they don't remember Martin Luther King. You know, you know, once you go through the fight and you win, or you at least survive, and things start getting better, you forget. And that's, you know, it's just like World War II veterans who didn't really speak about their experiences until Ted Koppel got them out and the stories. And what's worse now, there's nothing written anymore. Everything is on computers. So the books, you know, books that authors used to go, historians could go find written material. Where would it be now? Yeah, that's the danger. And, you know, as we die out and, you know.
So let's ask this last, oh, I'm sorry, you have a question.
Have you been videotaped as your story?
Ask that. Actually, let me ask it in a slightly different way. One is, have you been videotaped other than today? We are videotaping, so if
Right,
anybody
in fact-
wants to share this or videotape.
Yeah, I think
Share
it's
it.
streamed.
We've been streamed and will be
I
archived.
can't even swim.
So I guess I want to add to that question, not only have you been taped, but Steven Spielberg, we all know
Oh, yeah,
his
I did a
movies.
social.
Does everybody know Steven Spielberg's movies? All right, that's a familiar name. Star Wars is like my favorite. Were you part of
Yes,
that
I did a
project?
I did a show interview.
Mrs. Kirchheimer, I'm so sorry.
Give us 1 second.
Oh, I didn't see you, I was looking
Yes.
through it. Yeah, because we need to.
Okay, so
Okay.
you have been videotaped other than
Yeah.
today. All right, so